A lot of Gen Zs, they are really surviving paycheck to paycheck, and they don't want to live lavishly. They just want to survive, and they just want to have at least enough saving and to have a dignified salary.
So maybe let's go on to our next question for Anas. What do you think are the main challenges right now when we talk about low wages in Malaysia?
I think we have to take a step back. When we look at the data, 2/3 of graduates nowadays are paid less than 2,000 ringgit. And we can say that, in the market there are jobs that pays you well, but the reality is 2/3 are paid 2,000 ringgit and below, right? So that's the reality. And if you look at the job market itself, nationally, unemployment rate is 3.3%. But youth unemployment rate in May 2020 was 10%, but now in July 2024, it's around 6.5%. So job market has been improving for the youth. However, we have to look into the details. And as you mentioned, when we talk about low wages, 2/3 are paid 2,000 ringgit and below. And then we can see that in comparison with the suggestions, for example, by the central bank, Bank Negara Malaysia, where they mentioned that a single individual that is working has to be paid at least 2,700 ringgit to be able to meaningfully contribute to the society. If you're married, at least 4,500 ringgit. And this begs the questions of economic stability and of course upward mobility for our youth nowadays, whereby if they are not paid enough, how can they survive in the current economy? Because as you mentioned, we can always say about our old folks before this, maybe they are paid 2,000 ringgit 40 years ago and now it's still 2,000 ringgit. Is that insane? I think that's very insane. And third, when we look into the surveys, I want to echo what Celine mentioned, is that 9 out of 10 Gen Zs nowadays, they are looking to purpose in what they do. So I think it's very important for the Gen Z itself that you have your idealism, you know what you want to do, and try to align that in the job market in the company that you're applying to as well.
Yeah.
So I think the challenges would be, number one is of course wages, and number two is how do you balance your idealism and of course your living wage as well.
All right, so now let's shift the conversation to talk about policies. What needs to be changed in terms of policies, government policies, and so that the industry's players could also change because of these.
Thank you so much, Saraya. I think every industries would have their own policies that can be implemented. But looking at the macro level, I want to suggest perhaps 3 things. Number one is that I hope employers can look towards the job market in a more empathetic manner. A lot of Gen Zs, they are really surviving paycheck to paycheck, and they don't want to live lavishly. They just want to survive, and they just want to have at least enough saving and to have a dignified salary. As we mentioned, that the latest median salary in Malaysia is 2,800 ringgit, and that means that half of Malaysian are getting 2,800 ringgit and below, and 2,800 ringgit and above are the another 50%. And the reality, as I mentioned, the central bank has put the dignified salary or living wage of 2,700. So we can see that half of Malaysians are not really paid enough and fairly. This comes to the proposal of having a more transparent wage job market. For example, right now I really want to commend Kesuma as well as Ministry of Economy, in which that in their recent Dasar Gaji Progresif or their progressive wage policy, they mention the guide of the starting salary for our fresh graduates. For example, auditor, they have to be paid around 3,280. Philosopher/political scientist like me, a bit sad, 2,240 ringgit, and then for civil engineer, 3,115 ringgit. What does this mean is that we have a baseline so that our Gen Zs, when they enter the job market, they can know, well, I can be paid this much, and if I'm paid below, what are the justifications from the employer side, and what are the values that I can propose to them, and what are the skills that I've attained during my degree, for example. And number 3 is that if we look at the wage ratio in our country, there is a big gap. The labour share of income in Malaysia, which means Malaysian company are getting 100 ringgit in revenue, only 32 ringgit is paid back to the employer. If we compare to our developed countries, for example in the UK or in the US, it's around the range of 50 to 60%. So they give back 50% of what they earn to the employee itself. And this begs the questions, the pay gap between the first level executives and the CEO. For example, in the UK, if you are paid £2,000 in the minimum salary, the Prime Minister is only paid £14,000, so 7 times more than the minimum wage. In Malaysia, it's 15 times more, even though PMX doesn't take any salary. And in some industries, the pay gap can be 300 times. So that means you can be paid 2,000 ringgit, and your big bosses up there can be paid 700,000 ringgit per month. So I think we have to recheck whether this is compatible to the job market or not. Okay, if we don't want to touch the CEO, at least give them a dignified wage. So that is what we need to do, and to ensure that we look into the job market in a more empathetic lens. Yeah.
Now, what do you think about or looking at things the way Celine just mentioned earlier, kind of changing the perspective? Because nowadays, of course, some companies still look at coming to the office as being sort of like a formality, right? But then the product or the end goal is different. Yeah. So you have anything to say on this?
I think I truly agree with what you mentioned, because I think flexibility is something that Gen Z truly yearns, right? They really love being able to work from home, and they will take that particular factor as one of the factors while choosing a job. If I can share, like, had a friend who just changed job because that job gave him 2 days at home, for example. So I think this is a really big thing that the employees nowadays will have to take into the factor, because it's not only about wages, as you mentioned, it's also about the environment. It's about the vibe, whether, how do you appreciate your employees. And of course, all of these flexibilities can be given from the employee side. You have to know that you have a goal to achieve, that you have a purpose that you have to do, responsibility that you need to do, because when given the flexibility, it is important for you not to break that trust from your employer, because breaking that trust would make the perception for the employer to remove all of these benefits that are given. So I think once you're given the chance, once you're given the perks and the benefits, do that to the fullest and perhaps pay it forward later.
Your final thoughts. What would you suggest, or what are your hopes within the next few years in terms of policies, in terms of change? We're talking about all of this very optimistically. Would you like to go?
Number one, I think Gen Z needs to strategize in their career, because according to research, the first job is usually the most important crossroad of your career. For example, if you are choosing the first job that are not suitable to your backgrounds, for example, and does not pay as much as you would like, so that would hinder, or that would be an obstacle for you once you try to get another job. Because according to research, only 43% of graduates receive jobs that match their qualifications. So what happens to the other 57%? So they are in an underqualified job, or they are overqualified for that job, that particular job. So I think we have to relook into this. And of course, I mentioned about wage transparency. You need to know that there is a guidance that you can follow. There's also guidance from the government side, and on the flip side, from external sector, is, for example, websites such as Glassdoor, or we also have Malaysian Pay Gap, the community-based platform for you or for Malaysians to share their wages anonymously. So know your worth. And lastly, I want to know that not everyone would have this privilege of choosing their own jobs, because not everyone would come from the same backgrounds. So this is why intervention from the government is important. We have programs such as My Step, Protege, lainnya call it G's, right? But the market now for that particular program is around 2,100 ringgit, which is, I mentioned, below the living wage as stated, and it's around the minimum wage proposed by UNICEF itself, which is 2,100 ringgit in comparison to 1,500 ringgit. So if hopefully, in the near future, the government can re-look into this and give a more dignified salary for our Gen Z and our young generations.